The cold, conditioned air of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall felt thin in Evelyn Thorne's lungs, sharp with the mingled scents of 1,000 competing perfumes and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. It was a place designed to diminish the individual, to make one feel like a gilded footnote in the grand text of history and power. Tonight, it was succeeding. Flashes from cameras ricocheted off diamond necklaces and sequined gowns, creating a galaxy of fleeting, man-made stars. The theme was Gilded Futures, a celebration of technological optimism. But the atmosphere was pure old-world hierarchy, a carefully choreographed ballet of influence, where every glance was a transaction and every smile a negotiation. Evelyn, at 70, was an anomaly in this glittering ecosystem. She was not a creature of this world. Her power was of a different sort, quieter, denser, rooted not in spectacle, but in substance. As the founder of Thorne Capital, the world's most influential ethical investment firm, she moved markets with the weight of her conscience. She built and dismantled corporate empires based on a simple, radical principle that profit should not be divorced from human dignity. This philosophy had made her a titan, but it had also made her a perpetual outsider in rooms like this, where dignity was often the first commodity to be sold. Her gown was a deep, unadorned column of midnight blue silk, a custom piece by a young, sustainable designer she was mentoring. It was elegant, impeccable, but in a room of feathered trains and jewel-encrusted bodices, it was a whisper. It was a statement of intent. And in this particular jungle, it was perceived as a weakness. She was standing near the Temple of Dender, the ancient stone cool and impassive behind its glass enclosure. When Rebecca Sloan approached, Rebecca was the host of the evening, a real estate magnate whose name was emblazoned in gold leaf on half the new, soulless skyscrapers piercing the Manhattan skyline. She moved through the gala not as a guest, but as a queen surveying her court. Her dress was a torrent of silver, catching the light with every perfectly calibrated movement. Her blonde hair sculpted into a severe, architectural style that mirrored the buildings she erected. "Evelyn," Rebecca cooed, her voice a silken thread of condescension. She placed a manicured hand on Evelyn's arm, her touch feather-light but proprietary, a small circle of donors, the kind of people who measured their worth in private jet mileage, turned to watch. The air thickened with anticipation. "How wonderful of you to come. It's always so refreshing to have you." Evelyn offered a polite, neutral smile. "Rebecca, a spectacular evening. Your foundation should be very proud." Rebecca's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze flickered down Evelyn's simple gown and then back up, a journey of a mere 2 seconds that felt like a meticulous, demeaning audit. "Thank you," she said, her voice just loud enough for the circle to hear. "And I must say, it's brave of you to wear something so surprisingly modest, a testament to your principles, I suppose." The insult was a masterpiece of social cruelty, a quiet, precise scalpel cut delivered with a surgeon's smile. It wasn't an attack on Evelyn's taste, but on her very presence. It implied she didn't understand the rules, that she didn't belong, that her principles were a quaint, provincial handicap in a world of glorious, unapologetic excess. The donors exchanged nearly imperceptible smirks. A woman with a diamond choker that could have solved a small country's national debt let out a titter that sounded like ice cubes clinking in a glass. For an infinitesimal moment, the gilded hall dissolved. The scent of lilies and champagne was replaced by the smell of damp earth and rust. The polite chatter faded, replaced by the rhythmic, deafening clang of a loom in a cavernous factory. Clang thump. Clang thump. The sound of her father's life, and his failure. She was 12 years old, standing in the doorway of her father's office at the Northgate textile mill. It was late. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil and wet wool. Her father, a man whose hands were always stained with dye, and whose spirit was woven from threads of integrity, was slumped over his desk. Spread before him were ledgers filled with numbers that didn't add up, columns of red ink that bled into one another like open wounds. His partner, Henry Sloane, stood over him, his face a mask of fury. "You have to sign." Arthur Sloane's voice was a ragged roar. "It's the only way. We sell to them. We take the loss. But we survive. Your pride is going to sink us all." Her father, Arthur Thorne, looked up. His face, usually so full of gentle strength, was ashen, defeated. "It's not pride, Henry. It's our name. It's our promise to this town. These people depend on us. Signing that paper means betraying every last one of them. They'll be out of a job either way." Sloane slammed his fist on the desk. "This way. At least we walk away with something." Evelyn had watched from the shadows, a knot of pure, helpless terror tightening in her stomach. She had felt the crushing weight of their world collapsing, and she could do nothing but watch. She was a child, invisible, powerless. A week later, the mill closed. The looms fell silent. The town of Northgate, Pennsylvania, began its long, slow death. And Henry Sloane, ruined and broken, was found in his car at the edge of the abandoned quarry. The shame of it clung to her family like the damp mill air, a legacy of failure she had spent her entire adult life trying to outrun, to overcompensate for, to build an empire of ethics upon, so that no one could ever again make her feel so small, so powerless, so utterly and completely humiliated. Evelyn's eyes refocused on Rebecca Sloane's perfectly made-up face. The memory, sharp and brutal, receded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. The heat of shame she felt in that moment was the same she'd felt as a child hiding in the doorway, a feeling she had sworn she would never experience again. Rebecca Sloane, with her casual, venomous comment, had unknowingly picked at the oldest, deepest scar on Evelyn's soul. Evelyn's expression remained placid, her posture serene. She let the silence hang for a beat too long, forcing the circle of onlookers to lean in. Then, she met Rebecca's gaze, her own eyes dark and unreadable. "Bravery has nothing to do with it." "Rebecca," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the density of a black hole. "It's simply a matter of knowing the difference between value and price." She gave a small, final nod, a gesture of dismissal so subtle it was almost imperceptible, and turned away, leaving Rebecca Sloane standing with a fixed smile on her face and a flicker of confusion in her eyes. The donors, sensing the shift in power, quickly dissolved their circle. As Evelyn walked away, moving through the opulent crowd, her calm exterior was a perfect, crystalline shell, but beneath it, something that had been dormant for decades had finally, irrevocably, awakened, a volcano of cold. Calculated fury was beginning to simmer. Rebecca Sloane had meant to humiliate her, to remind her that she was an outsider in their gilded world. She had succeeded, but in doing so, she had made a catastrophic error. She had reminded Evelyn Thorne of a promise she'd made to a powerless 12-year-old girl in a dying factory town that she would never again stand by and watch her world be destroyed. This wasn't about a dress. It was never about a dress. It was about an old debt. And Evelyn Thorne always, eventually, collected the gala, with its fleeting glories and fragile hierarchies, faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the quiet, methodical work that lay ahead, the work of deconstruction. The next morning, The city was a beast of steel and glass, roaring with the sound of commerce. Evelyn's office, on the 74th floor of a tower in the financial district, was the antithesis of the Met Gala's chaotic opulence. It was a sanctuary of minimalist order, of clean lines and muted colors, gray slate floors, brushed steel fixtures, and a single, panoramic window that offered a god's-eye view of the world she sought to reshape. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, mournful wail of a ferry horn from the harbor, a city indifferent to the tectonic shifts happening within its walls. Evelyn sat at her desk, a vast plane of polished ebony, a single tablet glowing before her. She had not slept. The ghost of her father's failure, resurrected by Rebecca Sloane's careless cruelty, had sat with her through the night. It was a ghost she knew well, but one she had managed to keep at bay for years, buried under layers of success and philanthropic endeavor. Now, it demanded attention. Her first call was not to a broker or a lawyer, but to a man who operated in the shadows where truth and secrets were traded like commodities. Julian Vance was a private investigator, but that title was woefully inadequate. He was a corporate archaeologist, a digger of digital and financial graves, a man who could find the cracks in the most impenetrable facades. He was 65, with the weary eyes of a man who had seen the worst of human nature and the quiet patience of a hunter. "Julian," Evelyn said, her voice devoid of pleasantries, "I have a new project for you." I assumed as much. Julian's voice rasped through the speakerphone, a dry rustle of gravel and cigarette smoke. "I saw the pictures from the gala. You looked unimpressed." "My expression is irrelevant. I need you to build me a universe. Everything there is to know about Rebecca Sloane. Not the polished version from her company's prospectus, or the fawning profiles in architecture magazines. I want the foundation, the skeletons, the whispers, financials, personal history, political connections, enemies. I want to know where she vacations, what she fears, and, most importantly, who she had to step on to get to the top of her glass tower." "That's a tall order," Julian said, though there was a note of relish in his voice. "Sloane is famously private. Her PR team is a fortress." "Fortresses are designed to protect something." "Julian," Evelyn replied, "find out what it is." There was a pause, and Evelyn could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. "This isn't your usual due diligence. Evelyn, this feels different. Is this about an acquisition or an exposé?" Evelyn stared out at the city, at the Sloane Tower glinting arrogantly in the morning sun. "Let's call it a moral audit," she said. "Send me your retainer. I expect your first report by the end of the week." She ended the call and turned her attention to the second phase of her plan. Revenge, for Evelyn, was not a passionate, messy affair. It was a strategy, a sequence of moves on a chessboard so large her opponent wouldn't even realize a game was being played until it was too late. Her weapon of choice was not slander or gossip, but the cold, irrefutable logic of the market. She brought up the portfolio for Sloane Properties, a sprawling empire of commercial real estate, luxury condominiums, and, as of late, a highly publicized foray into urban renewal projects. Rebecca had built her brand on being a visionary, a ruthless but brilliant developer who could transform blighted neighborhoods into glittering hubs of prosperity. It was this public image, this carefully constructed persona of a tough but benevolent city builder, that Evelyn would target first. With a few keystrokes, she began to move her own pieces. She instructed her top analysts to perform a deep dive into the labyrinthine network of shell corporations and LLCs that held Sloane Properties debt. It was a subtle, almost academic exercise, but it was the financial equivalent of dusting for fingerprints. Later that week, she attended a small, exclusive luncheon for the city's philanthropic elite. Rebecca Sloan was there, holding court at the center of the room. When she saw Evelyn, her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before her mask of saccharine politeness slipped back into place. "Evelyn, darling," Rebecca said, gliding over, "I do hope I didn't offend you the other night. It was all in good fun. The pressures of hosting. You know, the apology was an insult in itself. A pat on the head to a child who couldn't take a joke." Evelyn smiled, a placid, unreadable expression. "Not at all. Rebecca, I found your comment clarifying." Clarifying, Rebecca tilted her head, intrigued. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and even. "It reminded me that some people build their legacies on solid ground, while others build them on glittering facades. It's important to know the difference." She let the words hang in the air, a perfectly crafted piece of verbal poison coated in politeness. Rebecca's smile tightened at the edges. She understood she was being challenged, but the attack was so veiled, so wrapped in philosophical abstraction, that to react defensively would be to admit weakness. It was the first move in their verbal chess match, and Evelyn had taken a pawn. That Friday, Julian's first report arrived. It was a lean, encrypted file, but its contents were dense. He had bypassed the public relations fortress and found a side door, a disgruntled former CFO of Sloan Properties, who had been pushed out after questioning Rebecca's accounting practices. The report detailed a pattern of aggressive, borderline predatory, real estate acquisitions. Rebecca targeted struggling, often minority-owned, small businesses in gentrifying neighborhoods. She would use a series of shell companies to buy up the surrounding properties, jack up the commercial rents to unsustainable levels, and then, when the businesses were on the brink of collapse, swoop in with a lowball offer to buy them out. Her urban renewal projects were built on the ashes of dreams she herself had extinguished. It was brutal, but it wasn't illegal. It was just the ugly, standard practice of a certain kind of capitalism. But buried deep in the file, on the last page, was a small, seemingly insignificant detail. It was a piece of personal data, a footnote in Rebecca Sloan's biography. Birthplace Northgate, Pennsylvania. Evelyn froze. The name hit her like a physical blow, a ghost word from a buried past. Northgate, the dying factory town, the place where her father had lost everything, the place where Henry Sloan had ended his life. She pulled up an old digital archive, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She searched for Henry Sloan, Northgate, obituary. An old, grainy newspaper clipping from the Northgate Chronicle appeared on her screen. The date was from over 50 years ago. The article was brief, a tragic but common story of a man broken by economic collapse. It listed his survivors. He is survived by his wife, Eleanor, and his 7-year-old daughter, Rebecca. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The cold, impersonal quest for revenge had suddenly become a head-on collision with her own history. Rebecca Sloan's animosity, her sneering condescension at the gala, it wasn't random social cruelty. It wasn't just about class or status. It was a vendetta. For 50 years, Rebecca Sloan, the daughter of her father's ruined partner, had been carrying the weight of that town's collapse. And she blamed the Thorns. She had rebuilt her family's name into an empire of steel and glass, all while nursing a decades-old hatred. She saw Evelyn not as a business rival, but as the living embodiment of her family's destruction. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the panoramic view of the city blurring before her eyes. The game had changed. This was no longer about a slight at a party. It was a story of two families, intertwined by a tragedy that had poisoned a generation. Her father's ghost was no longer just a memory. It was a central player in a drama that was still unfolding. And Evelyn realized, with a chilling certainty, that in her quest to dismantle Rebecca's empire, she was not just seeking revenge. She was being forced to confront the complicated, painful legacy her own father had left behind. The audit was no longer just moral. It was historical, and the debt was far older and deeper than she could have ever imagined. The revelation that Rebecca Sloan was Henry Sloan's daughter reshaped the battlefield. What had begun as a calculated response to a public humiliation now felt like the inexorable pull of fate. A ghost story playing out in the boardrooms and ballrooms of Manhattan. Evelyn's mission became sharper, more intensely focused. This was no longer about teaching a lesson in manners. It was about excavating a shared, poisoned history. She called Julian Vance again, her voice tight with a new urgency. "Julian, I need you to change your focus. I don't care about Rebecca's vacation homes or her political donations anymore. I want you to dig into the Sloan Foundation, the charitable arm of her company. She uses it as the cornerstone of her public image. I want to know if it's as benevolent as it seems." "You think it's a front?" Julian asked. "People who build empires on the ruins of others often need a cathedral to pray in." Evelyn said cryptically, "I want to know what sins she's hiding in hers." While Julian began to trace the flow of money into and out of the Sloan Foundation, Evelyn escalated her own subtle financial warfare. She now understood Rebecca's psychology. Her entire identity was built on overcoming the shame of her father's failure. Her obsession with success, with building indestructible towers of glass and steel, was a desperate attempt to create a legacy that could never be toppled like her father's fragile textile mill. Therefore, the most effective attack would not be a frontal assault, but a quiet erosion of that perceived indestructibility. Using Thorn Capital's immense influence, Evelyn began to short stocks in ancillary companies that supplied Sloan Properties concrete suppliers, architectural firms, high-end furnishing companies. It was a series of small, strategic pricks, creating whispers of instability around Rebecca's empire. At a conference on urban development, Evelyn gave a keynote address. She never mentioned Rebecca by name, but her speech was a blistering critique of vulture development, the practice of creating wealth by displacing communities rather than investing in them. "A skyscraper built on a foundation of broken lives is not a symbol of progress," she stated, her voice resonating with cold authority in the sterile, halogen-lit ballroom. "It is a monument to greed. And like all hollow structures, it is destined to collapse under the weight of its own moral bankruptcy." The speech was quoted in every major financial journal. The subtext was clear to everyone in the industry. Rebecca Sloan was being publicly, intellectually, and morally challenged by the most respected voice in ethical finance. The pressure began to show. At a charity auction a few weeks later, Evelyn saw Rebecca across the room. There were faint, new lines of stress around her eyes, a rigidity in her posture that hadn't been there before. When their eyes met, Rebecca's polite mask was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. She marched over to Evelyn, her silver dress shimmering like armor. "Your speech was quite something." "Evelyn," Rebecca said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "It takes a special kind of hypocrisy to lecture others on morality. Doesn't it? Especially for a Thorn." The name of their shared hometown hung unspoken between them. The air crackled. This was no longer a game of veiled insults. The swords were drawn. "My family's history is a matter of public record." "Rebecca," Evelyn replied, her composure absolute, "as is my father's integrity. He chose to go down with his ship rather than sell out his workers. Some see that as failure. I see it as honor. It's a concept that seems to be foreign in your circles." Rebecca's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Your father's honor destroyed my family. He broke his promise to my father and left him with nothing but debt and shame. You built your entire empire on the ghost of his guilt, polishing your halo with his dirty money. Don't you dare lecture me about honor." She turned and stormed away, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The confrontation had been quiet, but its intensity was volcanic. Evelyn stood perfectly still, the accusation ringing in her ears. "You built your entire empire on the ghost of his guilt." The words were meant to wound, and they did, because they touched upon a deep, private fear she had always harbored, that her success was nothing more than an elaborate, lifelong act of atonement for her father's failure. A week later, Julian delivered his report on the Sloan Foundation. It was the bomb she had been waiting for. The foundation was, as she suspected, a brilliantly conceived sham. On the surface, it donated millions to arts programs and inner-city scholarships. But Julian's forensic accounting had uncovered the truth. The foundation's primary activity was to purchase large blocks of derelict housing in low-income neighborhoods, citing charitable intent. Then, using a series of legal loopholes, it would declare the buildings uninhabitable, evict the tenants with minimal compensation, and sell the cleared land at a massive profit to a development company. That development company, hidden behind 3 layers of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, was owned by none other than Rebecca Sloan herself. She was using a tax-exempt charity to acquire land, displace the vulnerable, and then sell that land back to herself for development. It was a closed loop of predatory capitalism, laundered through the holy water of philanthropy. She wasn't just a ruthless developer. She was a fraud on a monumental scale, preying on the very people she claimed to be helping. And the most damning part, the biggest of these projects, the one that had won her a prestigious Humanitarian of the Year award, was currently underway in the South Bronx. The award was to be presented at the upcoming Global Finance Summit, a highly public, live-streamed event attended by the world's financial elite. It was the perfect stage. Evelyn looked at the evidence spread across her desk: bank records, property deeds, shell company registrations, and even a secretly recorded testimony from the foundation's former comptroller. It was an airtight case. This was the weapon that would not just wound Rebecca, but utterly annihilate her. It would destroy her business, her reputation, and the carefully constructed legacy she had spent her life building. As she prepared her strategy, a deep-seated unease began to settle within her. This was more than justice. This was total destruction. And she was about to unleash it on the daughter of the man her father's decision had driven to ruin. Was this truly breaking the cycle of pain? Or was she just perpetuating it with more sophisticated weapons? She found herself in her late husband's study that night, a room she rarely entered. It was preserved exactly as he had left it, filled with old books, maps, and the faint scent of leather and pipe tobacco. Her husband, Richard, had been her rock, the calm center of her ambitious world. He had known about her father, about Northgate, about the quiet shame that drove her. Her fingers traced the spines of the books on his shelves, tucked away behind a row of worn Dickens novels. She found a small, locked metal box. She had never seen it before. Her husband had been a man of few secrets, curiosity overriding her grief. She found the key in his desk drawer. Inside was not jewelry or old letters, but a series of meticulously kept private ledgers and a single, sealed envelope addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began in his familiar, elegant script. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, And you have found the one part of my life I kept from you. Not out of deceit, my love, but out of a desire to protect you from a burden that was mine alone to carry. I knew how much Arthur's failure haunted you. I knew how you built your life to be the opposite of that tragedy. But there is a part of the story you were never told. Because your father, in his pride and his pain, could never bring himself to speak of it. The decision to close the mill was not his alone. It was a joint decision with Henry Sloan. The company they were being pressured to sell to was a notoriously predatory corporation. They would have stripped the mill for parts and left the town with nothing. Arthur's plan was to refuse the sale, declare bankruptcy, and use his personal savings to create a severance fund for the workers. It wouldn't have been much, but it would have been something. Henry initially agreed, but at the last minute, he panicked. He took the company's remaining liquid assets, a substantial sum meant for the severance, and invested it all in a desperate, high-risk stock gamble, hoping for a miracle to save them. He lost everything in a single day. The money was gone. The severance fund was empty. What broke Henry was not the bankruptcy, my love. It was the weight of having betrayed his own workers. Arthur never told anyone. He took the blame for the full collapse to protect his friend's memory. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. She picked up the ledgers. They detailed 50 years of anonymous payments, donations to a relief fund for Northgate families, anonymous scholarships for children from the town, and, most shockingly, a series of large, untraceable wire transfers to an account belonging to Eleanor Sloan, Rebecca's mother, for years after Henry's death. Her husband, and before him. Her father had been secretly making reparations for decades. Her father wasn't a noble failure. He was a man who had shielded his partner's devastating mistake, carrying the weight of a false narrative to protect a dead man's name. The entire foundation of Evelyn's life. The story of her father's honorable defeat that had fueled her ambition. Was a lie. A noble lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. And Rebecca's righteous hatred, the fuel for her own ruthless ambition, was built on that same lie. Evelyn looked at the file on her tablet, the one containing all the proof of Rebecca's fraud. Her path to justice was clear, but now, it was hopelessly, tragically complicated. To destroy Rebecca now, with this newfound knowledge, felt different. It was still a necessary act. Rebecca was a predator who needed to be stopped. But the clean, satisfying arc of revenge had fractured. If she exposed Rebecca, she would also have to expose the truth about their fathers. She would be destroying one woman's life based on a lie, while simultaneously revealing that her own life had been built upon another. The climax would not be a simple victory. It would be a messy, painful, and public exorcism of the ghosts that had haunted both their families for half a century. And she would have to decide, on that global stage, whether true justice required the whole, complicated truth to be told, regardless of the cost. The day of the Global Finance Summit arrived with a cold, metallic gleam in the autumn sky. The venue was a monument to modern capitalism, a soaring atrium of glass and steel, where the world's most powerful figures gathered to discuss the future of money. The air hummed with a low-frequency current of power, a mixture of hushed conversations in a dozen languages, and the electronic chime of market updates. Evelyn Thorne moved through the crowd, a figure of quiet gravity in a charcoal gray suit. She was on the program as a last-minute addition, a speaker on the future of corporate ethics, a slot she had secured through a strategic call to the summit's chairman, an old acquaintance who owed her a significant favor. No one knew her true purpose for being there. To the world, she was simply Evelyn Thorne, the conscience of capital. She saw Rebecca Sloan holding court near the main stage, basking in the glow of imminent recognition. Rebecca was radiant, dressed in a sharp, cream-colored suit, the very picture of female empowerment and success. She was accepting congratulations, laughing with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She had no idea she was standing on a precipice. When her eyes met Evelyn's across the crowded room, she gave a small, triumphant smirk. It was the look of a woman who believed she had won. Evelyn felt a profound wave of weariness wash over her. The fire of her anger had cooled, replaced by the heavy weight of the truth she now carried. The ledgers from her husband's secret box were a tangible burden in her briefcase. This was not the clean, righteous execution she had once envisioned. This was a tragedy, generations in the making, and she was merely the instrument of its final, messy act. The summit began. Speeches were made. Panels were held. Finally, the time came for the Humanitarian of the Year award. A slickly produced video montage played on the massive screens flanking the stage, detailing Rebecca Sloan's incredible philanthropic work. It showed her cutting ribbons at community centers, smiling with scholarship recipients, and speaking passionately about giving back to the city. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, and the audience of billionaires and CEOs applauded enthusiastically. Rebecca walked to the stage, her steps firm, her smile dazzling under the spotlights. She accepted the heavy crystal award and stepped to the podium. "Thank you," she began, her voice thick with practiced humility. "I am so deeply honored. When I started my career, I was driven by a simple belief that success is not measured by what you build for yourself, but by what you give back to the community. My father, a man of great principle, lost everything because he believed in his town. He taught me that our true legacy is the impact we have on the lives of others. The Sloan Foundation is my attempt to honor that legacy, to lift up those who have been left behind, and to build a future where prosperity is shared by all." Listening to the speech, Evelyn felt a knot of cold pity in her stomach. Rebecca's entire life was a monument to a fiction. Her hypocrisy was breathtaking, yet it was rooted in a genuine, misguided pain. As Rebecca finished to thunderous applause, the summit's host stepped forward. "Thank you, Rebecca Sloan, for that inspiring message, and now, for a special address on the critical importance of ethics in our global economy. We are honored to welcome the founder and chair of Thorne Capital, Ms. Evelyn Thorne." A polite, more reserved applause filled the room. Rebecca's smile froze as she saw Evelyn walking toward the stage. Confusion, then suspicion, flickered in her eyes. She remained on stage, trapped by protocol. As Evelyn took her place at the podium, Evelyn adjusted the microphone, her gaze sweeping over the powerful faces in the audience. The cameras were on her, broadcasting her image to millions around the world. She could feel Rebecca's hostile stare burning into her side. "Good afternoon," Evelyn began, her voice calm and steady, commanding the cavernous room into silence. "I am here to talk about legacy. Mizzy Sloan just spoke eloquently about her father's legacy. My own life has been shaped by the legacy of my father, Arthur Thorne." She paused, letting the name hang in the air. She saw a flash of recognition and hatred in Rebecca's eyes. The trap was set. "For 50 years," Evelyn continued, "I believed my father's legacy was one of honorable failure. And for 50 years, Miss Sloan has believed his legacy was one of betrayal. It appears we were both wrong." She gestured to the main screen. The smiling faces of scholarship students were replaced by a stark, black-and-white document, the deed of sale for a block of tenements in the South Bronx, purchased by the Sloan Foundation. "Legacy is a story we tell ourselves," Evelyn said, her voice turning from reflective to razor-sharp. "But facts are stubborn things. The Sloan Foundation tells a story of charity. The facts, however, tell a story of fraud. A shocked murmur rippled through the audience. Rebecca took a step forward, her face paling, but a summit official gently restrained her. One by one, Evelyn presented the evidence. Bank statements showing the flow of money from the foundation to the offshore shell company, property records, the sworn affidavit from the former comptroller. Then came the human element. The screen showed short, pre-recorded video testimonies from the evicted tenants of the Bronx tenements. A grandmother who had lived in her apartment for 40 years, now in a homeless shelter. A young father who lost his small business on the ground floor. Their faces, full of pain and confusion, were a devastating counterpoint to Rebecca's humanitarian award. The room was utterly silent now, the air thick with shock and horror. The live-stream chat windows, visible on monitors throughout the venue, were exploding with outrage. Rebecca was shaking, her mask of composure shattering into a million pieces. "This is a lie," she hissed, her voice a ragged whisper into a nearby microphone. "These are lies. She's a bitter rival, trying to destroy me." "The truth is not a rival, Rebecca. It is a reckoning," Evelyn said, her voice softening slightly. "And the truth of our families is more complicated than either of us knew." She signaled for the final document to be displayed on the screen. It was the first page of her father's secret ledger, showing the initial payment into the Northgate Relief Fund. "My father did not betray your father," Evelyn said, her voice now filled with a quiet, profound sorrow. She looked directly at Rebecca, speaking to her alone. "Though the world was watching, your father, Henry, in a moment of desperation, lost the company's last funds in a risky investment. My father, Arthur, concealed that fact to protect his friend's name. He spent the rest of his life, and my husband after him, anonymously trying to repair the damage done to your family and to the town of Northgate. The story that has fueled your anger, the story of Thorn betrayal, was a shield my father created to protect the memory of yours." She projected the records of the payments to Rebecca's mother. The evidence was irrefutable. The revelation struck Rebecca with the force of a physical blow. She staggered backward, her face a canvas of disbelief, horror, and utter devastation. The foundation of her life, the righteous fury that had driven her to build an empire, was built on a lie. Her father was not a noble martyr. Her enemy was not a dynastic villain. Her entire existence had been a misguided quest for revenge against a ghost who was never there. She let out a single, guttural cry, a sound of pure, animal agony, and collapsed onto the stage. The camera zoomed in, capturing her complete and total unraveling for the world to see. Her empire of glass was shattered. Her humanitarian award lay on the floor beside her, a cruel, glittering mockery. Evelyn watched, but she felt no triumph. There was no catharsis in this victory, only a vast, empty sadness. She had won. She had exposed the fraud and cleared her family's name. But in doing so, she had destroyed a woman who was, in her own way, as much a victim of the past as she was. The cycle of pain, started in a dying factory town 50 years ago, had finally culminated in this brutal, public immolation. As aides rushed onto the stage to tend to Rebecca, Evelyn stood alone at the podium, the architect of a just and necessary destruction, feeling nothing but the profound weight of the ghosts she had finally laid to rest. In the immediate aftermath of the summit, the world erupted. The story was a media supernova, a perfect storm of corporate malfeasance, dynastic secrets, and public immolation. Rebecca Sloan's name became a global shorthand for hypocrisy. News channels played the clip of her collapse on a loop. Federal investigators, spurred by the public outcry and the mountain of evidence Evelyn provided, descended on Sloan Properties and the Sloan Foundation. Indictments were handed down. Assets were frozen. The Sloan Empire, once a symbol of indestructible ambition, crumbled into dust and litigation. Rebecca vanished from public life, a pariah confined to her Park Avenue penthouse. The gilded cage, now a prison of her own making. The press reported she was under psychiatric care, broken by the simultaneous destruction of her company and the entire narrative of her life. For Evelyn, however, the silence that followed her victory was deafening. She had expected to feel vindicated, liberated. Instead, she felt hollow. The ghost of her father was no longer a specter of failure, but he had been replaced by a more complex, sorrowful shade, a man who had carried a secret burden of guilt and complicity his entire life. She retreated from her own company, leaving the day-to-day operations to her trusted deputies. The world wanted to celebrate her as a hero, a champion of ethics who had slain a corporate dragon. But she saw no heroism in what she had done. She had simply been the final gear in a long, tragic machine of cause and effect. Days were spent in her late husband's study, poring over the ledgers and his sparse, heartbreaking notes. She pieced together the full story of his quiet, 50-year atonement. He had tracked down dozens of families from Northgate, sending anonymous aid, funding college educations, helping to start small businesses. He had tried, in his own way, to undo the damage, one life at a time. It was a legacy of quiet repair, a stark contrast to the loud, public destruction she had just wrought. She spoke at length with Julian Vance, who had become less of an operative and more of a confessor. "I did what had to be done," she told him, staring out her office window at the now infamous Sloan Tower. Rebecca was a predator. She was harming innocent people. But it doesn't feel like justice. Julian, it feels like I just ended the story, and everyone lost. Some stories don't have winners. Evelyn, the old investigator said, his voice gentle. They just have survivors. You exposed a truth that needed exposing. What you do with that truth now, that's what defines your victory. His words lingered with her. What you do with that truth now. Her revenge on Rebecca was complete, but her responsibility to the history she had unearthed was just beginning. Justice, she realized, was not a single act of retribution. It was a process of restoration. She had torn something down. Now she had to build something in its place. The answer, she knew, was not in Manhattan. It was 200 miles west, in the forgotten corner of Pennsylvania where the story had begun. 3 weeks after the summit, Evelyn Thorne drove herself to Northgate. The journey felt like traveling back in time. The gleaming spires of the city gave way to the rolling hills and, finally, the scarred, post-industrial landscape of the Rust Belt. Northgate was a ghost of a town. The once bustling Main Street was lined with boarded-up storefronts. The great brick edifice of the Sloan Thorne textile mill stood silent and decaying by the river, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the town it had both created and destroyed. The air itself seemed heavy with a collective memory of loss. She met with the town council in a drab, wood-paneled room in the municipal building. They were old, weary men and women who looked at her with a mixture of awe and deep-seated suspicion. To them, the name Thorne was a curse, a synonym for the broken promise that had doomed their home. Evelyn did not come with apologies or grand pronouncements. She came with a plan. She laid out blueprints and financial projections on the council's worn oak table. "I cannot undo the past," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I cannot bring back the jobs that were lost or heal the wounds that have festered for 2 generations. But I can invest in a future." She announced her intention to establish a new foundation, funded with an initial endowment of $200 million of her personal fortune. It would not be named for her. She slid a piece of paper across the table. On it were the proposed words, "The Northgate Foundation for Community Renewal, founded in memory of the Thorne and Sloan families." The council members stared at the paper in stunned silence. The inclusion of the Sloan name was a gesture of reconciliation so profound it was almost shocking. "This foundation will not be run from New York," Evelyn continued. "It will be run by you, by the people of this town. Its first projects will be to revitalize this main street, to provide grants for local entrepreneurs to open new businesses, to establish a state-of-the-art vocational school in the old mill building, training the next generation for jobs in renewable energy and advanced manufacturing, and to create a scholarship fund that guarantees every child who graduates from Northgate High a fully paid college education." She was not just offering a handout. She was offering a rebirth, built on the ashes of the past, but looking toward the future. She was using her power not to destroy, but to heal, to build, to right a historical wrong in the only way she could. She was breaking the cycle. Months turned into a year. The work in Northgate began. The sound of construction replaced the sound of silence. New facades appeared on Main Street. A coffee shop opened, then a bookstore, then a small restaurant. The old mill was gutted, its decaying bones reinforced with new steel, its vast spaces repurposed into classrooms and workshops. There was a palpable shift in the town's atmosphere, a fragile, tentative flicker of hope. Evelyn was there every step of the way, not as a distant benefactor, but as a partner. She walked the muddy construction sites, attended town meetings, and had coffee with the new business owners. She found a quiet, meaningful purpose in this work that all her years of boardroom battles had never provided. One crisp autumn afternoon, she stood on a newly paved sidewalk across from the revitalized mill. A group of young students were heading inside for their first day of classes. The Thorne Sloan name was not carved on the building. Instead, a simple bronze plaque near the entrance read, "For the people of Northgate, past, present, and future." She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet resolution. The ghosts of her father and Henry Sloan no longer felt like burdens, but like historical markers, reminders of the fragility of pride and the enduring power of reconciliation. Her revenge was complete. Not because Rebecca Sloan was ruined, but because the community that their family's feud had broken was finally beginning to heal. Her victory was not the sound of a gavel falling in a courtroom, but the sound of laughter from a new generation walking through the doors of the old mill, into a future their grandparents could never have imagined. She had wielded her power like a sword, and then like a trowel. She had torn down a monument to greed, and, in its place, laid the foundation for a legacy of grace. Her reflection in the new glass of a storefront window showed an old woman, her face lined with the maps of a long and complicated life. Her eyes clear. She was no longer running from the past. She had finally made peace with it.